Hello, you're watching The Perspective. I'm your host, Rafae Iqbal, and in today's show, we'll be deliberating on the dire situation in the Middle East. Of course, I'm talking about Israel's genocide against the population of Gaza, of course, in that regards. When we talk about the overall conflict toll, it has claimed 38,000 Palestinian lives and wounded a lot of others. Of course, in regards to that, there were efforts by the international community as seen in the United Nations as well, and the massive protests can be seen that were held, pro-Palestinian protests all around the world, specifically in the Middle East and even in Europe and America. And of course, in that regards, there were mediation efforts also being held by the United States, Qatar and Egypt for a truce and a ceasefire deal and a possible hostage release deal as well. But the mediation efforts did not bear any fruit as far as now. And of course, Israel has also intensified its genocidal actions in the Gaza Strip, even though there has been a lot of international criticism, even by its ally, the United States, and Israel still continued with its operation in Rafah. Of course, in that regard, Israel not listening to what the international community has been asking it. And of course, it continues with its aggressive tactics. Now, there are many other the different institutions of the United Nations. They have also highlighted how Israel has not been paying heed to their calls, such as the UNRWA, and of course the journalists that have also been killed in the Israeli strikes recently. These are the different aspects that we'll be discussing, and of course we'll also be discussing the case by South Africa in the International Court of Justice, and how Spain has also expressed the desire to become a part of the case along with South Africa. And of course, there were European countries as well that have recognized Palestine in the recent past, which also plays an effect into how this conflict is going to shape up. We'll be deliberating on all these different aspects of the Gaza conflict. In the studios, we've been joined by Dr. Tughral Yamin, senior analyst and retired brigadier from the Pakistan Army. Along with that, we've been joined by Jauhar Salaam Saab, former Foreign Secretary and President of Institute of Regional Studies. Along with that, on phone line, we have been joined by Dr. Adnan Sarwar, who is a Foreign Affairs and a policy expert. Thank you all for your time and being part of the conversation. I'll start from Dr. Tughral Yamin and ask him, as we've seen that Israel continues with its offensive and its aggression against the innocent Palestinians, and there's whole cry from the international community, the world at large, asking Israel to stop. But Israel ignores and still continues, and the conflict further increasing from just Hamas to now the confrontations with Hezbollah also increasing. How do you see the conflict shaping up?
Rafae Saab, it's very unfortunate, it's very sad. Whatever is going on in Palestine is unprecedented. Whatever is happening in the Gaza Strip it's a disaster. Genocide is a very soft term for it. It's brutal. It's inhuman. I think even the Mongols did not do what we are doing in the 21st century. And Israel can listen. Israel will listen if the United States of America really wants them to listen. Right. Israel would also listen if the Arab states are really willing to put an end to whatever is happening. The sad part is that the world at large, the world that matters, is not pressurizing Israel. If right. There have been United Nations Security Council resolutions saying that you will not supply arms to the Israelis. Germany continues to supply them arms. The UK continues to supply them arms. India continues to supply them arms. It's absurd. India is also supplying them arms. So it's so sad that defenseless women and children are being killed. They are bombing schools, which is against any norms of humanity. It's against the international humanitarian law of combat. You cannot bombard schools. You cannot go into places of worship. You cannot go into hospitals. The Israelis are doing everything. The only thing what the world at large is doing, making pious statements. Please don't do it. Please don't do it. Please don't do it. This won't help, because Israelis are bent on eliminating Hamas. At least Benjamin Netanyahu is very clear that he will not stop short of it's ethnic cleansing. In other words, he would continue to eliminate them, because if this stops, then his own political future is in doubt. I'm talking about Netanyahu.
Right. Jauhar Salaam, what's your viewpoint on the domestic pressure in Israel? But of course, as the biggest ally of Israel, the United States has also asked Israel many times in the past few months, especially when it was beginning with its Rafae operation, asking them to stop. But Israel did not pay any heed to that. They didn't also pay heed to any of the matters and any of the solutions talked about in the United Nations. And of course, in the ICJ as well, they had a disregard. How do you comment on the overall situation so far?
Yeah, this is a very, very unfortunate situation, and the tragedy as it is folding in Gaza right now. The whole world is lamenting over it. But the fact is, what are the actors which matter? First of all, Israel itself, the Prime Minister Netanyahu, who has been a great survivor there, and he's known for his ruthlessness, in politics as well, and in relation to the Palestinians. So he is not paying any heed, like you said, to the international pressure, which has been building for quite some time. That is one thing. The pressure initially was from the Muslim countries, as well as countries like China and Russia. But subsequently, we saw pressure building even in Europe. There was a lot of pressure in Latin America as well. Countries like Brazil, which they even withdrew their ambassadors from there. And then we see that pressure coming to a point where in the United Nations, there were resolutions. Initially, the resolutions did not succeed because of the US veto. But eventually, even US relented and allowed some of the resolutions to pass, because they could have vetoed them, but they did not, because they had been involved in the consultations, prior consultations, before those resolutions were presented. Now, that is one facet of it. In the US, there has always been a bipartisan support for Israel. Israel's security is rooted in their very foreign policy tenets. It's a cornerstone of their foreign policy, so to speak. And it's a very symbiotic relationship, because US is very important for Israel, but Israel is also very important for the US, not just because of the very strong Jewish lobby there, which is there, which is a political reality. It's a political reality, it's a cultural reality, it's a social reality there. But also because there are certain interests that the US has in the Middle East, where Israel's continued presence as a strong military power is important. So it's a two-way traffic in that way. And this is nothing which is it's an open secret, and the US leaders, they always make statements about that Israel's security is paramount for the US. Now, in terms of what the Israelis have been doing there, the Americans initially they supported that, but subsequently it was a more nuanced approach, and we even saw some criticism by certain officials of the administration at certain points, and we know now that there was a great deal of pressure from President Biden, on Netanyahu as well. And why was that? Because of 2 or 3 reasons. One reason was the international pressure, because America could see that Israel is totally isolated, and because of that, America was getting isolated as well. Because America is a country which, which has it's a soft power in the world,
right,
as a country which is, which has been acting as a guardian of human rights and international law and a rules-based international order. So that whole thing that was that impression was blowing apart. That was one thing. The other thing was the internal pressure within the US. It's an election year, and Biden is facing a very tough election, as we know. And his constituency, the Democratic constituency in the US, that has certain segments. For instance, the Arab Americans. For instance, the progressives. For example, the women, and the Muslim Americans, so all these segments, the young, they were putting pressure. There were demonstrations all over the US campuses, and there was a huge protest. So that increasing pressure also forced Biden to play a more proactive role. And so what did America do? They started 2 or 3 different tracks of negotiations. This mediation which Americans are conducting between Hamas and the Israelis, primarily the intelligence agency, Mossad, David Barnea is heading it. That is one track. But the other track was, there was a track between the US and the Israelis about how they should conduct the operations, because the Americans were putting pressure on them to keep the casualties, the civilian casualties
Definitely.
minimum. But of course the Israelis were much more ruthless than that. But so on that, the technical details of that, they were having negotiations as well. But the first negotiation, and and I have been saying that in my previous commentaries on that, when people were talking about how the other countries can play a role and how the United Nations can play a role and the world bodies, other UN world bodies, I had been consistently saying that, look, Israel is not going to listen to that. Israel will disregard any United Nations resolutions as well. What will eventually matter is the back-end negotiations being conducted by, through the American auspices between the Israelis and Hamas. Now, those negotiations have many a time they've come close to fruition in terms of a temporary ceasefire. But more recently, now, what we see in recent days, there has been a talk that there has been a breakthrough because Hamas has agreed, because President Biden has himself put forward a proposal in that regard, and in that proposal there were there were 3 points, but generally speaking it was about a phased sort of ceasefire.
So Mr. Jauhar, you're talking about more diplomatic efforts to put an end to this,
which I think are sort of now they have entered a decisive phase in my view. Those this back channel this mediation which America is conducting, and Egyptians and Qataris, and other countries are helping in that. I think, as we know that David Barnier traveled to Qatar, to meet and the Qatari Prime Minister, but also, of course, probably there'll be some parleys indirectly, perhaps, because Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas, is based in Qatar. So I think eventually, these negotiations perhaps would succeed at some point, and they will be, because now Hamas has conceded. One of the big concessions they've made recently, as per the media reports, is because they were insisting initially and throughout they have been insisting that whatever ceasefire takes place, in exchange of all the hostages that they still hold, should be permanent. But now they're
of course, diplomatic efforts, and everyone hopes that there's a breakthrough in these negotiations. I'd like to include Dr. Adnan Sarwar in the conversation as well. When we talk about Israel not heeding to what the world community is saying, when we talk about Israel not heeding to what its ally, the United States, is saying, and it continues with its aggressive tactics and strategy, and of course with its genocidal acts, it is now engaging and having more confrontations with Hezbollah on the Lebanon border as well. How do you see Israel not paying any attention to the world calls, to what everyone is saying? And when it continues with its aggressive tactics, it could lead to a further deterioration of this conflict. Dr. Adnan, are you with us?
Let's be clear on this point that Israel has point blank rejected all the efforts of a permanent peace. In fact, you see the demand of Hamas for a permanent ceasefire is a very logical one. And also that their next demand that the displaced Palestinians ought to be allowed to be relocated to go back to their original homes in the whole of the Strip, Gaza Strip. So these are very, very logical demands, because a 6 weeks kind of a ceasefire would be a very temporary one. And as you have also said, that they are not heeding to any such kind of an appeal, which sounds very, very urgent, and that which the entire world, and particularly the civil society, one good thing which has emerged, though, you see in this all bloodiest conflict ever, that the people of the world from all faiths and religions and races, they have come out in the streets, particularly in the United States, West, etc., the whole of the world, and particularly in United States and UK, and the students, as was just being said by one of the panelists. So, this is something which very positively has emerged. And yet you see, if the democratic world, so-called, and Israel also calls itself a democratic country, in Israel now, the people are in the center of Israel to demand the ceasefire, resignation of the government. Now, this clearly means that Netanyahu is bent upon to destroy the military capability, as he is announcing also, and its military wing is also announcing, the defense minister, that they would like to completely make Hamas incapable of fighting any other kind of independence war. But as you know, once a week ago, 10 days ago, Mr. Daniel Hagari, the military spokesman of Israel itself, said that, well, Hamas is an idea, and if there is no better alternate, Hamas cannot be defeated at all. So this was a very, very sound warning to the government of Israel. But anyway, I think, realistically speaking, that the world is still appeasing Israel. And this appeasement policy has never worked in such kinds of situation. And if only you see some arms muscle is shown, whether diplomatic or economic or a combination of the two, as well as some military one, in the sense that you see the Arab League, I'll first of all criticize Arab League as well, along with all those who are militarily supporting Israel, like United States, UK, etc., that they have not developed their military muscles. Had they been good in that, and Arab League would have military wing, and the attack on one Arab country or nation would have considered as attack on all, as is the main principle of NATO. This would have been a totally different story. So, and then the adjoining countries, Syria, Egypt, and Lebanon, etc., Jordan, they are not showing that kind of a resolve which should have been shown these bordering countries of Israel or the area. So I really am disappointed, but nevertheless, I believe that the international community, its cry would prevail upon, and sooner or later, this madness and this bloodlust and bloodthirsty Israel would stop at one point, and that the world has come to that point where not only just a permanent ceasefire, but I think root causes of this problem, which is there for 75 years, will be addressed.
Right. Dr. Tughral Yamin, since we're also talking about how it's affecting, it's not only affecting Gaza or the Palestinian population, of course it has a direct impact on them, they're the victims in the war, but when we talk about the political landscape of those parties that are on either side of the conflict, those supporting Palestine, those supporting Israel, such as the US and their other European allies, when we talk about these kind of, when we talk about what side the world community is going to stand on, there's a clear bias, and there can, as can be seen with the protests, with the demonstrations all across the world, with the United States, the university protests, it was an old, their sort of an Arab Spring. How do you comment on that and the phenomena, the whole sentiments that people have with the Gaza conflict affecting the domestic politics and domestic infrastructure of the countries?
The problem, Rafae Saab, is that public doesn't matter. In the US, as Jauhar Salaam Saab has rightly pointed out, there's bipartisan politics, and it is enshrined in their foreign policy, in US foreign policy, that security of Israel is paramount, so they will never turn away from supporting Israel. So there might be university protests, there might be Arab Muslims, there might be other people, there might be pressure groups who would saying, hey, they stop it. They will not stop it. And although there is visible panic within the Democratic camp now with the disastrous performance by President Joe Biden in the last presidential debate, and this open talk that he might be dumped and a new candidate might be put in his place, but even if he runs in the election, even if he takes part in the election, there is more likelihood that Donald Trump is going to become the president of the United States again. I am no soothsayer, but he's even more Israeli oriented than Mr. Biden, because his son-in-law Jared Kushner is a Jew, and he was the one who actually advocated the Abraham Accords. It was under Trump's watch that the American embassy was shifted from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and there were settlements inside West Bank which were encouraged by Donald Trump. So whatever the government is in place, they will continue supporting Israel. We can see the case of Great Britain also, although we have a new prime minister over there, Keir Starmer, but he is also pro-Israel, and he has, although he claims to be an atheist, but he has Jewish antecedents. He has been raised as a Jew, so that notwithstanding, he might be a Muslim or anything, but he has not given tickets to people who were pro-Palestine. He has actually not given them tickets. So although the pro-Palestine candidates have won in the elections in Great Britain, but they don't matter. So the new prime minister is going to call the shots, and he's not pro-Palestine. And so is the case with Europe at large. The governments, notwithstanding what the public sentiment is, will continue to support Israel. And this has happened earlier also. During I recall the first Gulf War, I was attending a course in Germany, and there were people who were openly protesting that we don't want to shed blood for oil. Kein Blut für oil. This was the rallying cry, but the government was supporting people who were against the Arabs. So this is how it happens. The governments are pro-Israel, people may be pro-Palestine, but it doesn't matter really.
Right.
And what's happening in Lebanon is also something very serious. It has the potential of wider escalation of war in the Middle East. So all these things have to be taken in perspective. That I don't see any outcome at the moment, really, despite all the diplomatic efforts.
Right, Dr. Tughral, that's that excellent point made, and I'd like to come up with my next question regarding that. Mr. Jauhar Salaam, when we talk about democracy, the true essence of democracy is that the governments, they reflect the true sentiments of the people. With regards to the Israel-Palestine conflict, when we talk about the governments representing the true will of the people and the true sentiments of the people, and it can be seen it's happening otherwise. Do you see that going up to a bigger conflict within those countries?
Well, what we've seen so far is, of course, within the realm of public opinion, it changed dramatically during the inception of this conflict. Of course, the public opinion in the West was for Israel after the 7th October attacks. But as the casualties mounted on the Palestinian side, and as the brutality of the Israeli operations became more and more evident, and as the innocent civilians, like not only the killings, but also the way they were starved, and they didn't have any electricity, and sort of, like everything, even the basic semblance of human amenities was wiped out. Following that, everything started changing. So we saw a situation where in those countries there were mass protests, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands. And by the way, these are far bigger than the protests that we saw in Muslim countries, for that. So that was there. But in terms of the government, we have seen some sort of, nuances, of course, some difference in attitude. For instance, you yourselves mentioned that Spain is joining, which is true. Spain has they had made the intention clear to join South Africa in a case against Israel, something which would have been unthinkable, some time ago. Similarly, other countries, there were some European countries which recognized Palestine in total disregard of the US wishes, or of course the Israeli wishes. There were some European countries which stopped the provision of armaments, supply of armaments to Israel. There were some European countries which came up with very strong statements. So it was not like we didn't see any visible cracks. There were cracks there. The support Israeli support, where it has really held steadfast, of course, the US, and I've explained the dynamics for that, and Dr. Tughral has added to that, I think, quite well. Then the UK.
Right.
UK, of course, UK is a special case because amongst the population, of course, we saw some of the biggest demonstrations there, and in the election, this Gaza conflict has been a factor, and people have won or lost their seats on that basis as well. But we have to recall that, again, there's this bipartisan support, for Israel in the UK as well, to the extent that, like Labour Party a few years ago had this leader, Jeremy Corbyn, and he lost the leadership, I think amongst other reasons, because of allegations of anti-Semitism, So this could be such a factor. Anybody who's seen as an anti-Semitic or anybody who's seen as against Israel cannot have a leadership position in the major Western democracies.
Right.
So I think that is but we cannot really say that all those countries, the governments are not caring at all, and while the people want one thing and the governments are doing another. We see a varying degree because you see within the United Nations, the diplomacy that we've seen there, there were visible cracks there as well. The US did not have unqualified support of all the countries in Europe, or what to talk of the countries in South America, for instance. There we saw even wider divergences. So that is there, but you see the room for maneuverability. When the fact of the matter is that let's say what could these countries done, for instance, if they really wanted to do something within the United Nations? Okay, I think they did try there. The United Nations security resolutions were passed, but then the debate whether they were under Chapter 6 or Chapter 7 instead of, and the Israelis felt they they claimed that they were non-binding, and of course then nobody, pushed for it because, in another instance they could have passed another resolution very categorically saying, stating that there was going to be a resolution under Chapter 7, but that never happened. You see, so there are limits to the international pressure that can be applied to on Israel,
right,
because of primarily the US support to Israel, and also to a lesser degree the Western support to Israel. And of course the fact that Israel itself is a very powerful country militarily, economically, and the Jewish lobbies everywhere in the world, they are very strong. That's one thing. I think our other panelists had mentioned something about the need for the Arab countries to be together and and sort of that could, if they had done so, something like if they had set up.
I'll come to that point. But before that, I'd like to ask Dr. Adnan Sarwar Khan his views as well, since we're talking about how the European countries, they have started recognizing Palestine. How do you see that holding up and shaping up the conflict? And of course, as a blow to what Israel had claimed earlier.
Yes, this is a very good sign indeed, and as was being said that despite the displeasure of the United States and the United Kingdom, the key backers of Israel throughout its history, the countries of Europe also are increasing in numbers to recognize Israel, and this is the realization that they have made quickly, that this kind of a very clear brutality, a naked brutality, cannot be accepted at all, and the Palestinians really deserve a right of independent and sovereign statehood along with Israel in what is known in the world as two-state solution. So this is going to lead, I'm very much clear, and I believe that though slowly but certainly, with the passage of time, in the very near future, some of the other European countries may also on the way of the recognition of Palestine. So this will, I think, and I am a little optimistic here, because you see, once in South Africa also, the United States was supporting apartheid regime till 1993-94, and then because of people's pressure in the United States who came out in the street, United States had to abandon that policy. In Vietnam also this happened. People didn't want to see United States involved in that war, and in many other places. So people's voice really matters, and that's why I believe that the United States and UK somehow have started supporting the ceasefire efforts. Otherwise, they would have been as much indifferent as Israel itself in the non-diplomatic solution, that is the military solution. Nonetheless, you see, I'm of the view, and whatever I have studied on this matter since the last couple of months, 9 or 10 months, even before, that this wider conflict scenario is not going to be in the favor of either Israel or the United States or UK, because Ukraine war is also there, and they also have a competition with China, etc. So these are those kind of matters in which probably they have realized that they cannot, and this is the biggest deterrence, I'll say, and I'll add emphasis here, the Palestinians' resistance and their courage and bravery, I cannot, and the world cannot express in the world, in the words. So therefore, I think that they have realized that this is not a nation which is just a group of people, Hamas, but it is a nation which is there and standing side by side. You know, you would have seen, and this is very strange and very encouraging as far as the struggle of Palestine is concerned, that not a single Gazan has condemned Hamas for whatever it has done on October 7 last year, and they have not rebelled against it. This is phenomenal. Though I myself say that Hamas did something which was blunderous as well. They should not have captured or made hostage the civilians. They could have taken the military personnel with them, and they should have been plan B, plan C, which they didn't have. Yet, you see, the resolve of the Palestinians, the common person in the United States, UK, Europe, the women, they are weeping over the dead bodies of the babies. This has never happened. So many wars with Palestine or Israel, people never came in the streets, never came in the 1948 war, 67 war, 73 war against Intifada. So if this has happened this time, this means that not only ceasefire will be arranged somehow, though you see some interim setup would be established, maybe with the Palestinian Authority or with the United Nations peacekeeping force. Dr. Yamin can say more on that. But I think that they have not been able, the Israelis, despite their brutal most acts, the will of the Palestinians.
Right, of course. With that, I'd like to move towards Dr. Tughral and ask him, as we've seen in the recent past, Israel has been attacking the journalists as well. Many have died in the conflict, and there's a media shutdown as well because Israel's unabated and continuous attacks, they do not allow for media coverage, and of course journalists are losing their lives as well, which proves how Israel has turned it not into a war zone but a genocide zone. With that, do you think social media has played a role in creating this shift where people have been getting real-time information and they can actually see what Israel is doing on ground, and that has caused a shift in the major countries which are allies of Israel, but the people, the masses in those countries, they're relenting and rebelling against the government's policies, their government's policies.
So media has played an important role. Media always plays an important role. We have had war journalists, and now, as you said, social media is also playing a role. Unfortunately, the internet is very patchy inside the Gaza Strip and West Bank also. I think very little is coming out from there, but whatever is coming out has created powerful images. People have seen the brutalities which are being carried out, especially the children who are being killed, and the journalists have been killed. We know the Al Jazeera has been banned. We know some of the journalists have been very, very brave, and they have been in spots where normally even a soldier would dread to put his foot. But what Sarwar Khan Saab was saying about peacekeeping forces, Pakistan has proposed that. The Arab League has proposed that about an international protection force, and there is a clause which says R2P. It is accepted by the United Nations. R2P means responsibility to protect. In case of UN peacekeeping, you have to have the consent of parties, otherwise you cannot send UN peacekeeping troops into a war zone or a conflict zone. But R2P means that you can actually override that rule. So if countries are willing enough to put their soldiers into harm's way, international protection force can be assembled and it can be sent. And if we have people from NATO, for example, from other powerful military blocs, then Israel can be kept in check, because these people within Gaza Strip, after all, how many Hamas fighters are there? A few thousand, not more than that. But the larger public, originally there were 2.5 million people, 40,000
displaced people.
The actual population I'm talking about. Displaced people are 250,000 or something like that, but around 50,000 have been killed. So most of these people are unarmed, and even the Hamas fighters are rack-track troops. They had makeshift rockets which they fired, and I don't know if they are still hiding those rockets inside the tunnels or not. But sending an international peacekeeping force can make the difference if the world can muster enough courage.
But requires consensus from the world community.
Even without consensus, you can send them, but then you must have powerful armies within it. Pakistan alone cannot send. You see, it has to be an OIC force, or even OIC would not be accepted. People would say that this is a Muslim force. It has to be some kind of force which has Christians and Muslims and atheists and everybody combined together.
A joint effort.
I think that is there is a distinct possibility to assemble that kind of a military force and even a police force in case you have a ceasefire. In case you have a ceasefire, in the post-conflict scenario, you can send such kind of force. That is my personal assessment.
Dr. Tughral, that was a very important point that you raised. I'd like to move towards Mr. Jauhar Salaam, and I'd like your quick views on it, since we're running short on time as well. As you earlier mentioned, how organizations could play an effort in mediation efforts, such as the OIC, the Arab League, as Dr. Tughral brought up. Do you think there should be more efforts by such organizations to put international pressure? Because United Nations has had its say, the ICJ has and is currently hearing the trial. But more efforts from organizations like the OIC and Arab League, do you think they're going to make a difference?
Yeah, three quick points actually. One is what Brigadier Saab said.
Right.
I think, unfortunately, international politics and international relations requires a way, I mean, our hearts go out for the Palestinians, you know what is happening there. But it requires a very dispassionate analysis of the situation. So even if the Arabs would have gotten together, we saw the time, we know in the history, in 1948, they all got together and attacked Israel, and we all know what happened, In 1969, they did that again, and we all know what happened. So it doesn't always work. These powers, these power equations work very differently, based on very different realities. That is one thing. The second point is, which is an important point, this responsibility to protect, R2P, as Dr. Tughral has mentioned. Now, this R2P, this was an idea which came about in the 90s. In 2005, it was basically passed by the United Nations, by all the countries, the 2001 countries assembled. So it is now part of international law, so to speak. But if you have to invoke that, it has to be done through the United Nations. It has been invoked in certain instances. First of all, it was invoked in the case of Kenya, actually in 2007, 2008. Then secondly, it was invoked in the case of Libya. Then they tried to invoke it in the case of Syria, but that effort did not succeed.
Right.
So for that, it is, but that is like, again, that like passing a United Nations Security Resolution under Chapter 7. So unless you have that support, and unless the Americans are on board, it's not possible, So now the last point, the third point, what you mentioned, these international organizations, multilateral organizations. So what I said was a little different. What I said was that in my view, it would not have worked, basically OIC and okay, this is good enough for putting some pressure, on the Americans, for instance, in the United Nations, perhaps, even in the United Nations Security Resolutions which were passed, they helped in building more pressure on the Americans and on the Israelis, you know. And in fact, that is why the Americans wanted, in the end, those resolutions to pass, so that there was greater pressure on Israel, you know.
Right.
But despite that, we have seen what has happened. What I said was that, and that has been, I've been saying for a long time, that eventually what will work is the negotiation that the Americans are conducting, that they are mediating between Hamas and between the Israelis. And that is where, you know, like basically, you know, whatever sort of, you know, like temporary solution to this problem may occur lies, you know. We have to all sort of keep our fingers crossed to, you know, to hope that the negotiations succeed.
Right.
And I think the negotiations have entered a decisive phase. That's one thing. Lastly, I think there was a point mentioned here that, you know, the two states, of course, you know, solution and you know, like, because that was part of Oslo Accords, and the world wants to see that. And recently, I think one silver lining in the cloud was that President Biden put up this idea of what he termed as a grand reconciliation. So that had three components. One was to sort of, you know, to end this conflict. The second was to then work on that sort of, you know, broader negotiations for what he called a path to statehood for the Palestinians. And the third prong of that was a grand reconciliation between Israel and the Arab countries, including the Saudi Arabia. Now that idea is being pursued by the you know, by the Americans, but we have to see how far can it succeed in the coming you know, months and
of course, fingers
years.
crossed, and we hope to see positive results. Dr. Adnan, what are your quick views on how these multilateral fora can play their part? Because we heard what Mr. Jauhar Salaam had to say. I'd like to hear your views as well.
Oh, yes, I'll say that this is a classic combination of war and diplomacy, and Israel in fact is trying its best to pressurize as much Hamas and the opponents as possible. This we all know, but then you see, if it continues with this arrogant attitude and non-compromising attitude despite some kind of U.S. prodding, and now it's a good thing that United Kingdom's new Prime Minister's new Foreign Secretary also has called for immediate ceasefire. So it would be a kind of now a double pressure. But you know, if this continues with Israel, I think in the larger run, in the long term, it itself in the first place is going to insecure itself, because it would be a continuity of war and continuity of sabotage activities against the state of Israel, not only in Israel proper, but the world over. And Israel interests would be threatened, and the Palestinians have this capacity to attack the world over the Israel's interest as well as the supporters of Israel's interest. So I think that instead of securing itself, I fear that, well, Israel with its continued warfare is going to insecure itself. So this is something that the international negotiators must realize upon the foreign minister and the defense minister and the prime minister more than anybody else, that they have to come around peace. And but if this golden opportunity is wasted again, and I was very, very disappointed to have heard the incoming president, if it is so, say President Trump, that he said that Israel must get it done by even killing 20 or 30,000 more Palestinians. This is even a non-different attitude than President Biden. But that is stupidity. It cannot be said by a competitor in the U.S. election. So I believe that better sense should prevail upon the U.S. leaders, U.K. leaders, and the international negotiators. But more than anyone else, Netanyahu, who is said to be surviving on this warmongering attitude, because this is going to be something that people say all over the world, if this is stopped without the rescue of the refugees, is his political death. So for the sake of
we also hope that sanity prevails in Israel, and of course they can realize what they are committing, the genocide they are committing, the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian population that is in place by the Israeli occupation forces. Of course, We hope sanity prevails there, and we hope that there's a breakthrough in the negotiations for the ceasefire as well. I'd like to thank all of our panelists, Jauhar Salaam, former Foreign Secretary and President of IRS, Dr. Tughral Yamin, Senior Analyst and retired Brigadier from the Pakistan Army, and of course Dr. Adnan Sarwar, Foreign Affairs and Policy Expert. I'd like to thank you all for your time and being part of the conversation. We'll see you same time on Friday. Till then, take care.